I have photographs of my grandfather here as a boy, an 8-year-old boy swimming in Avalon Bay in 1897. Roy came over with his parents and stayed at the Metropole, and then later Roy came over on his own and enjoyed the town, and he met Eleanor Ford here in Avalon, and they fell in love and were married about 1906 or 7. My father grew up in the summers coming to Catalina, and coincidentally, my mother's side of the family also became very involved in Catalina and leased a tent site. Their tent gradually evolved into a cottage. And my mother, of all of the children, she particularly loved Catalina. Grandfather George became acquainted with Chicken Johnny, and one of my mother's duties was going up and meeting the old hermit and getting the eggs for the family's use here in Catalina. There is a story that when William Wrigley Jr. bought the majority share of the Santa Catalina Island Company, that sometime in the early days of that, he tried to upgrade his shack and give him some of the amenities that thought he was being very nice, and including a wonderful bed and a very expensive down comforter, too fancy for him. So he gave that all over to the chickens. And he continued to sleep the way he had in his own way. He was happy. In 1929, on Memorial Day, the casino opened. Well, it was an instant hit. Dancing was a big evening pastime in those days, and a lot of the locals went. My dad remembers seeing her, and she caught his eye at that time. So my folks started getting seriously interested with each other and dated off and on. They'd meet in the summertime here, and eventually, in 1932, they were married. The Depression had set in pretty good. I was born in 1935. My father, he had to hustle to keep a new family going, and then my brother came along in 1937. So there was no Catalina. The war comes along, and life is going on as best it can. Very suddenly, we got news that my grandfather, George Richardson, passed away without having a very definitive will. And the family had a meeting and decided, well, we can get rid of Phyllis. We'll give her the Catalina house. My dad immediately started the process of getting the paperwork necessary. And in October of that same year, 1942, the military had come in. Mr. Wrigley and the Island Company had negotiated favorable agreements. They virtually gave the military facilities on the island. He was looking to keep the people here, the population here, keep the properties alive. The Merchant Marine came into Avalon and created the largest Merchant Marine training center in the United States. The Coast Guard came into the Isthmus. The Army had installations here. There was even a secret organization, the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA. They had a couple of installations, one of them at Toyon Bay and another one at another cove farther down the island. The paperwork came through, and it was equivalent to FBI investigation and getting a diplomatic passport, more or less. And I vividly remember the first time we were off to Catalina. We drove from San Gabriel down to the Wilmington area at the foot of Avalon Boulevard, where the steamer terminal had been for many, many, many years. The entire harbor area was filled with these barrage balloons, which were big gas balloons tethered at varying lengths. But the purpose was to make it very, very difficult, impossible, for fighter planes, should the Japanese launch attacks, from fighter planes strafing the harbor area. So we drive down through the gates, get through all of that, and end up at the steamer terminal, and there is the old SS Avalon. Well, it wasn't quite so old then, and it was painted battleship gray and armed with guns and military people all around. And you can imagine, I was about 7 and my brother was 5, and it was extremely exciting. And my parents were what a sense of memories of the past came flooding to them, from the days of the steamships being white and everybody festive and all of that. Here we were going to sail on a warship. All of the curtains were drawn over the windows. You could not see out at all. At sailing time, the purser locked us in. No cameras. Snug in the lounge, we set sail, and the steamer terminal was about a half an hour from the breakwater. After we got to the breakwater, the ship stopped. The purser opened the lounges, and we were able to go outside. And the ship would pull up until it was deemed safe and clear to open the submarine nets. The nets covered the mouth of the harbor. They were tethered on buoys on the surface, and it was steel netting that went down to the bottom. The trip took about 2 hours to get to Avalon. We got off the ship and came off the steamer pier. There was a ramp exit that took us to Sumner Street. And we walked up Sumner Street, and I can remember my mother and dad saying, "Look at this, look at that." I was totally entranced. And we walked up to Beacon Street and then over to the Catalina Street alley, and we walked up the alley to 317 Catalina. That was where the Richardson summer house had been since it was a tent back in 1890s. Walked into a large central room in the house that basically was the bedroom for the whole house. There were 4, maybe 6 beds in this room, and no ceilings in the house. The central room was decorated on the ceiling, what would be the ceiling, with a round, huge paper umbrella. It was yellow and orange. Nothing on the inside, no plasterboard or anything. The electricity was knob and spool, and it ran through one of the walls, and then there was one light bulb in each room. That was it. We were kept in the town. The roads to the interior were absolutely closed. The casino was used for training, and the St. Catherine Hotel, which is out in Descanso, where that was all for housing military personnel. The Pebbly Beach Road was closed. You couldn't go out there, so had no idea what any of that looked like. Burning oil would be put on the water, and the trainees would learn how to jump as if they were jumping from the side of a burning ship into the oil and not be burned. There would be a boat pulling a target, and the guns would be aiming to sink the target. So it was serious gunplay that way, and it was sort of reassuring to know that those guys were out there. Catalina Street to Sumner Street to Beacon Street on the top and down to the existing buildings was filled with these little cabins that they probably put 4 troops in them. They would, hey fellas, would you go down to John's Cafe or Eric's on the pier and get us 4 hamburgers? And they'd give you $1, and hamburgers were maybe 25 cents or less. And we'd go down and they'd give us a quarter or something like that. Things became a little bit more relaxed as our Navy sunk the Japanese fleet and diminished their ability to wage war. The worry about things happening around here in the oceans relaxed, and then that's when we made the move to Catalina to stay. Oh my goodness, yes. Ralph Glidden spent his time going around excavating Native American remains. During the war years that I've talked about, the Ralph Glidden's Indian Museum was closed. And so when it opened up again in 1946, I was very curious about what it looked like, and my brother was curious, and so we took our quarter and hiked up the hill to where the Indian Museum was located, and the door was open, and we walked in, and there wasn't a soul in sight. We just kind of stood there waiting for something to happen, and my brother John said to me, "Roy, this smells funny. I don't like this." And with that, Ralph Glidden appeared like a ghost out of ether, and he said, "Young man, I'll have you know this doesn't smell any worse than your house." And with that, John looked up at me. He'd grabbed my hand when the guy showed up. He looked at me and jerked away and went flying out the door and headed for home. And I stood there and I thought, well, you know, I'm sort of a peacemaker, and I didn't want to leave with rudely, and I wanted to get my quarter's worth. So I stayed and looked around and got out as quickly as I could leave. I think it was sometime in the mid or later 60s that he left for good. His bone collection had been purchased by P.K. Wrigley and donated to the museum just to get it away from Ralph and from selling it and all of that type of stuff. I'm sorry that in the day that it wasn't just reinterred, but hopefully someday we'll be able to do that. That, I think, is the goal of a lot of us that are involved and love the museum. Put them back where they belong. This was a big deal. The Catalina had been up in San Francisco Bay all during the war. It had been drafted and was known as the U.S. Army Ferry Ship Number 99. And the Cabrillo, which was a wooden-hulled steamship, had a similar designation. Well, the Catalina was returned to the Island Company and had to have a lot of work done on it, but she was ready for July the 4th, 1946. My mother had remembered the maiden voyage of the Catalina in 1924. Now here it is, 1946, and we're out in Casino Point waiting for the ship and seeing this white dot on the ocean get bigger and bigger, and all the whistles blowing, and the steamship answering with her majestic steam whistle from the smokestack and coming in, and it was just so exciting. A lot of people, a lot of young men and women would go out and go from North Beach and dive for coins. Throw a coin. We'd dive for the Catalina and then the Avalon, and the money was good. For a kid, it was, you know, it wasn't unusual to make between $5 and $10 a day. And I used to save that money and put it away, and I also had a paper route. You'd go up with your wagon, and Frank was his name, would give you, he'd count out 20 papers, 25 papers, whatever. And you'd go out, and everybody kind of had dibs on a certain street. I knew I had Catalina Street and Beacon Street, and you'd just go up in the middle of the street because there were no cars to speak of. Los Angeles Times, Herald Express, Examiner, paper. And people would come out and buy their papers, and the tips were really good. They were taking care of the kids. I was about 12 or 13, and I went to work for the city of Avalon for the harbor department. My boss was Duke, the old Duke, the greeter. He was also the head lifeguard and in charge of the beach boys. And what I worked on, what was called the salad boat. The salad boat was a rowboat that we picked up every morning from Joe's rent-a-boat on the pier. There were two of us per boat. One would row and one would scoop up seaweed and garbage and so forth out of the bay. Also make the round of the yachts and pick up the garbage off the yachts. That was the good one because you'd get tipped. I was making $1 an hour and happy as can be. My father had found out that this house was coming up for sale, and it was a very exciting prospect, but the court sale was going to be in some courtroom in Los Angeles. You had to have enough cashier's check for the money so that you could pay the whole thing right then. You had to walk out paid. And my father and mother had assets, but they weren't that liquid. And to raise that much money on a short time was difficult. So after a great deal of thought, I approached them and surprised them, I think, that I had the money to come up with half of it. So I'd saved a good deal of money as a kid, and that is how I ended up as a partner with my parents in this house where we're sitting today, and was very pleased and proud and to do that. My parents were very happy, and we worked out a way of living where we were very independent of each other, but have lived in the same building. And here I sit to this day. If you wanted to find Dad, you walked down to the pier. He worked as a carpenter up at the school when the new cafeteria auditorium was built. He built rowboats for Joe Guyan, but he was basically liked to be his own boss. My dad had an opportunity to buy a wonderful boat for conversion to shoreboat from Al Bombard, Doug Bombard's dad. It was called the Mahi Mahi. He was the first one to put radios on his shoreboats, and that was becoming pretty common on boats by that time after the war. And by gosh, they loved him. And eventually he bought out one of the competing companies, and then a couple of years later leased the last company. So for a while he had them all. He had that Irish skin that was very sensitive to the sun, and he just burned terribly on his lips and all. And he had a cousin who was an oncologist, and he said, "Leonard, if you don't get out of the sun, you're going to end up dying from skin cancer." So he sold the business, and he ended up in the clothing business, a sportswear shop. After college, I was drafted in the Army. Toward the end of that 2-year stretch, my dad was getting tired of the business that he was in, and he wanted to get back on the water. And he had it arranged to sell the store. But I saw an opportunity. I love business, and more than that, I loved Catalina. My dad was thrilled to death to have me come in and take over. My mother was thrilled. She'd had it with the big store, and she had opened her own store. She opened a ladies' store called Rose's Rag Shop, which she ran very successfully for 25 years or so. And then eventually, when circumstances changed, I moved my business down to my own building and was able to sell it. And then from that point on, I've been able to enjoy a very different life, and that life has been busy. I have had an interest in art, specifically paintings. But before I started buying, I started trying to acquire works of art from Guy Rose, the most famous of the ancestors that were artists. Guy was the slightly older brother of my grandfather. He passed away in 1925, 10 years before I was born, so I didn't know him. But there was a lot of talk about him in the family. The Impressionist movement, which my great uncle was an Impressionist painter. He painted with, he knew Claude Monet, and he knew a number of the American Impressionist painters who also spent time in Giverny. I had developed a collection of Guy's work and other artists who were his contemporaries and his friends. Nice representational works from every place they painted. Here in Avalon, we have had a lady who was an accomplished artist, who also was very adventurous and got out in the world of art. Her name was Denise Burns, Mrs. Robert Burns. She'd lived here with her husband Bob and raised 2 children. She'd go to art shows. She'd paint with well-known people and take lessons, and she became quite good. And she also had a tremendous desire to do more, to promote the art and get the artists together. She promoted an organization she called the Plein Air Painters of America, and she came to a number of us in town for help to put the shows on. I remember for several years I opened my house for tours and talks, and talked at length about how similar the lifestyles of the contemporary outdoor painters was with the historic outdoor painters. I showed them examples and charged a fee and helped raise the money. The show grew from a one-day, an evening gala to include a second day, midday sale, and the second day's sale was as big as the gala at the night and the night before, and we got up to where we were selling in the neighborhood of $1 million of art in one show. After writing a very successful book, publishing a very successful book on the paintings, on the art movement here in Catalina, we had workshops, we had tours to museums, just a lot of things where we promoted the arts. But after all was said and done, we turned over $660,000 to the Catalina Island Museum. That was the goal, and that's why the art gallery is called the Sapap Gallery, and those plazas upstairs are Sapap. I concentrated in my purchases on Catalina first. When I liked the artist's work, I would buy examples of his or her work from other places in the world. They all traveled. Eventually, the Catalina collection in total will go to the Catalina Museum, which they can keep or sell for their art fund as they see fit. and I feel very satisfied that it will be well taken care of and we'll find homes for it. In 2007, it was Mother's Day weekend occurred during this time. The brush was dry. It was the time of year that, drought or no drought, the brush would have been dry, and we all know better than to take any chances. Well, a welder working on one of the guy wires, sparks fell and ignited the brush, and off the fire went. And efforts were made to put the fire out, but they didn't have the proper equipment, no fire extinguishers, no skip loaders, none of the equipment that could have helped suppress the fire, get it out. By the time fire departments got there, it had outgrown the needs of the fire department, and we were in serious trouble. The wind was blowing, and it was blowing the fire right towards Avalon. I started taking my most treasured paintings first, taking them out of frames. The frame could burn, the frame could be replaced, but I could get more artwork packed by doing this. The Express and every other boat line and people who had any means of helping came rushing over to the island, and it's figured that about 50% of our population left, was evacuated to the mainland, to shelters. I took one last look around the house, and it was a very emotionally tough thing. It was like saying goodbye. I got down to my bedroom, which was kind of the end of the line, and I remember going to the window and looking out, and I was shocked. The flames were close, but the air was clear. The smoke had been pouring in our direction, and it had been just absolutely awful. But now the air was clear. So I opened my door and stepped out on my balcony, and I could look across the canyon and see the firemen in a line at the edge of the conflagration, and with their fire hoses and all this equipment. This meant that help had arrived from the mainland. They were rushed into town. I understand that they had to knock some of the golf carts out of the way. They'd just been carelessly abandoned, but they plowed through, and it was just like a miracle that the wind did a 180 degrees and stayed that way and blew the fire back against areas that had already burned. I was so tired and my back hurt, and I just laid back on my bed with my feet over the edge and just closed my eyes for a minute just to rest them. The next thing I knew, I snapped out of it, and it was 8 o'clock in the morning. I remember going downtown at some point and just walking around. The streets were empty. The island was absolutely closed. No visitors allowed. It was the first time that Catalina had been closed completely since World War II. Firemen that were on their break would come down and order a meal or whatever they needed. Everybody took care of them. They could go into the hotels and use the facilities, take a shower, clean up, free. The town rallied. I was just so proud to be an Avalon resident. Living in Catalina means everything to me. It's just a delightful place, and it's a delightful place to know people. I'm not going to find out how it is any other way. I'll be here until I go out toes up.